The bitter winds of the North Sea carved through the Norwegian fjords like invisible blades, carrying with them the promise of an early winter. Along the treacherous mountain path that wound between towering pine forests and jagged cliffs, an elderly Viking named Bjorn Ironbeard made his way slowly through the gathering dusk. His weathered hands gripped a walking staff carved from ancient oak, each step deliberate and measured, despite the urgency that burned in his chest. At 73 winters old, Bjorn had seen more battles than most men could count. His broad shoulders, though slightly bowed by age, still carried the strength that had once wielded a war axe with legendary precision. His grey beard, streaked with white and braided with small iron rings, caught the fading light as he paused to catch his breath. The deep lines etched into his face told stories of raids across distant seas, of victories won and brothers lost, of a life lived according to the harsh codes of his people. But today, Bjorn travelled not for glory or conquest. Today he carried medicine for his ailing grandson in the village of Stavanger, 3 days' journey through these unforgiving mountains. The healing herbs and rare remedies, purchased with the last of his silver from a wise woman in Bergen, weighed heavy in the leather satchel across his chest, not from their physical burden, but from the weight of hope they represented. The sky above had darkened to the color of storm clouds, heavy with the threat of rain that would soon turn to sleet. Bjorn pulled his thick woolen cloak tighter around his shoulders, the familiar weight of his sax, the long knife that had never left his side, a comforting presence at his hip. The path ahead grew treacherous as loose stones scattered beneath his boots, and he knew he would need to find shelter soon. As he rounded a bend where the path narrowed dangerously close to a steep drop, Bjorn's keen eyes caught sight of something that made him stop abruptly. There, huddled against a large boulder perhaps 50 paces ahead, was a figure in torn and bloodied clothing. Even from this distance, he could see the person was in distress, one arm hanging at an unnatural angle, dark stains spreading across fabric that might once have been fine. Bjorn's warrior instincts flared to life. This could be a trap. Bandits were known to use injured accomplices as bait for unwary travelers. His hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sax as he approached, with the careful predatory grace that had kept him alive through decades of warfare. But as he drew closer, his hardened heart softened at what he saw. The injured person was young, perhaps no more than 20 winters, with the lean build of someone accustomed to physical labor rather than the soft comfort of nobility. Their face, though pale with pain and streaked with dirt, held no guile or deception, only the desperate look of someone clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Dark hair, matted with blood from a head wound, framed features that spoke of strength despite their current vulnerability. "Please!" the young person gasped as Bjorn approached, voice barely above a whisper. I need help." Bjorn knelt beside the injured stranger, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the damage. A broken arm, certainly, and possibly broken ribs from the way they favored one side. The head wound, while bleeding freely as such injuries do, didn't appear life-threatening. But it was the infected gash on their leg that worried him most. He could smell the sickness in it, see the angry red lines that spoke of poison spreading through the blood. "What happened to you, young one?" Bjorn asked, his voice gruff but not unkind as he began examining the wounds more closely. "Bandits," came the weak reply. 3 days ago, maybe 4. I've been trying to reach help. My horse fell on the narrow path back there. I've been walking ever since." Bjorn nodded grimly. He'd seen the remains of the horse about a mile back, picked clean by ravens and mountain wolves. That this young person had survived 3 days in these mountains with such injuries spoke to remarkable resilience. "What's your name?" he asked, beginning to dig through his travel pack for clean cloth and what little healing supplies he carried. "Eric," came the reply. "Eric Thorson. I served Lord Hakon of Stavanger." The name meant nothing to Bjorn, but he noted the way the young man's voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness when speaking of his master. A loyal servant, then, probably separated from his lord's household by the bandit attack. "Well, Eric Thorson," Bjorn said, beginning to clean the worst of the wounds with water from his skin and strips torn from his own spare tunic. "I am Bjorn Ironbeard, and it seems the Norns have woven our threads together this day." As he worked, Bjorn found his initial wariness giving way to something approaching fatherly concern. There was something about this young man that reminded him of his own sons at that age. The quiet dignity with which he bore pain, the way his eyes remained alert and grateful despite his suffering. More than that, Eric bore his injuries without complaint, even attempting to help with his own treatment despite his broken arm. "You cannot stay here," Bjorn said finally, having done what he could with limited supplies. "The temperature will drop below freezing before midnight, and there are wolves in these mountains that grow bold when winter approaches." Eric's face fell. "I understand. You've done more than enough. I won't ask you to—" "Did I say I was leaving you?" Bjorn interrupted, a hint of gruff amusement in his voice. "I said you cannot stay here. That doesn't mean you stay here alone." The old Viking stood, his joints protesting slightly, and looked down at the injured young man. Eric was clearly too weak to walk, especially with that infected leg wound. The practical thing, the thing that made sense for a man his age traveling alone through dangerous country, would be to give what aid he could and continue on his journey. His grandson's life hung in the balance, and every day's delay could mean the difference between life and death. But Bjorn Ironbeard had not lived 73 winters by always choosing the practical path. Sometimes honor demanded more than practicality. "Can you hold on to me?" he asked, extending his hands to Eric. Eric's eyes widened. "You can't mean to carry me. I'm not a child, and you're old." Bjorn's laugh was like the sound of grinding stone, but not without warmth. "Boy, I've carried wounded warriors twice your size off battlefields while arrows fell like rain around us. What matters is not whether I can carry you, but whether you can hold on." Chiki. With careful movements that spoke of long experience with injured men, Bjorn helped Eric to his feet, then turned and crouched down. "Climb on. Keep your broken arm against your chest and try not to jar it. We have perhaps 2 hours of light left, and I know of a cave where we can shelter for the night." As Eric carefully positioned himself on the old warrior's broad back, Bjorn grunted slightly but showed no other sign of strain. He had spoken truly. This was far from the heaviest burden he had carried, but as he began the careful journey along the treacherous mountain path, he was acutely aware that every step took him further from his original destination, further from his grandson who waited for medicine that might save his life. Yet somehow, with each step, Bjorn felt not regret, but a strange sense of rightness. Perhaps it was the way Eric's quiet breathing against his neck reminded him of carrying his own sons when they were small. Perhaps it was the simple truth that leaving an injured person to die alone in the mountains would have poisoned whatever years remained to him. Or perhaps, though he would never have admitted it aloud, it was the way Eric's presence eased the loneliness that had become his constant companion since his wife's death 2 winters past. The cave, Bjorn remembered, proved to be exactly where he thought it would be. A deep recess in the cliff face, hidden behind a screen of hardy mountain pines and protected from the worst of the wind. He had used it for shelter before, during a hunting expedition years ago, and was pleased to find it still dry and defensible. As he carefully helped Eric down from his back and settled him against the cave's back wall, wrapped in both their cloaks, Bjorn began the familiar ritual of making camp. He gathered dry wood from the forest floor, started a small fire with flint and steel, and set water to boil in his iron pot. The familiar tasks helped settle his mind and gave him time to think about what came next. Eric watched in silence as the old warrior worked, clearly fighting to stay conscious. The combination of injury, blood loss, and exhaustion was taking its toll, but his eyes remained alert, tracking Bjorn's movements with what seemed like professional interest. "You've done this before," Eric observed quietly, as Bjorn expertly banked the fire to provide warmth without creating too much smoke. "Making camp?" "Aye, a few times." Bjorn's tone was dry. though usually with better company and fewer broken bones involved. Despite his pain, Eric managed a weak smile. "I meant caring for wounded men. You know what you're doing." Bjorn paused in his work, memories rising unbidden. "I was a ship's captain for 30 years. Raided as far south as the lands of the Franks, as far west as the Irish shores. You don't keep men alive through that kind of life without learning something about healing." He resumed his preparations, brewing a bitter tea from herbs in his pack that would help with pain and infection. "Besides," he added, not looking at Eric directly, "I had 3 sons once. Boys are always getting themselves hurt in the most creative ways possible." The simple past tense of had carried weight that Eric was perceptive enough not to probe. Instead, he accepted the tea Bjorn offered with quiet gratitude, drinking it despite its bitter taste. As the night deepened around them and the fire cast dancing shadows on the cave walls, Bjorn found himself studying his unexpected companion. There was something about Eric that didn't quite fit the picture of a simple servant. His hands, though calloused from work, were too clean, too well kept. His speech, while respectful, carried the cadence of someone accustomed to education, and there was a quality to his bearing, even injured and helpless as he was, that spoke of natural authority. But such mysteries were for another time. For now it was enough that the young man's breathing had steadied and some colour had returned to his face. The herbs were working, and the warmth of the fire was helping his body fight off the infection. "Sleep if you can," Bjorn said, settling himself where he could watch both the cave entrance and his patient. "I'll keep watch. These mountains hold dangers enough without leaving ourselves unguarded." As Eric's eyes fluttered closed, Bjorn Ironbeard sat in the firelight and wondered what the Norns had in store for them both. He thought of his grandson, waiting for medicine that might not come in time. He thought of his own advancing years and the solitary path he had chosen since his wife's death. And he thought of the strange sense of purpose that had filled him when he chose to help a stranger rather than continue his urgent journey. Outside the cave, the wind howled through the mountain passes like the voices of the dead, and the first snow of winter began to fall. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Norwegian mountains, painting the fresh snow that had fallen during the night in shades of silver and pale gold. Inside the cave, Bjorn Ironbeard woke from the light sleep of a warrior, instantly alert despite his advanced years. His first glance went to Eric, who still slept fitfully against the cave wall, wrapped in both their cloaks. The young man's breathing was steadier, and the fever that had worried Bjorn through the night seemed to have broken. Moving quietly so as not to wake his patient, Bjorn built up the fire and set water to boil. The infection in Eric's leg would need tending again, and they would both need food and warmth before attempting to travel. As he worked, Bjorn found his thoughts returning to his grandson, 3 days' journey away in Stavanger. Every hour of delay could mean the difference between life and death for the boy, yet he could not bring himself to regret his choice to help the injured stranger. Eric stirred as the smell of cooking porridge filled the cave. His eyes opened slowly, focusing with effort on Bjorn's weathered face. "How do you feel this morning?" Bjorn asked, ladling the simple meal into wooden bowls. "Better," Eric replied, and indeed his voice was stronger. "The fever broke sometime in the night. I remember waking once and seeing you keeping watch." Bjorn grunted acknowledgement as he helped Eric sit up to eat. "The infection is fighting back, but it's not won yet. We'll need to reach proper help soon, a healer with better supplies than what I carry." As they ate, in companionable silence, Eric studied the old warrior with curious eyes. In daylight, Bjorn cut an impressive figure despite his age. His grey hair, braided with small iron rings in the old style, framed a face that spoke of strength tempered by wisdom. Scars crisscrossed his hands and forearms, the accumulated marks of a lifetime spent with blade and battle. But it was his eyes that caught Eric's attention, pale blue like winter ice, but holding depths of kindness that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. "You said you were traveling to Stavanger," Eric said carefully. "That's where I served. Perhaps we might travel together." Bjorn looked up from his bowl, studying the young man's face. "Aye, it would seem our paths lie in the same direction, though I warn you, I travel with urgency. My grandson lies ill with the wasting sickness, and I carry medicine that might save him." Eric's expression grew troubled. "Then you should not delay for my sake. Leave me what supplies you can spare and continue your journey. A grandson's life is worth more than a stranger's comfort." The old warrior was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "When I was young," he said finally, "I believed that strength meant taking what you wanted and leaving the weak to fend for themselves. I raided and killed and took treasure from those who couldn't defend it. I told myself it was the way of our people, the will of the gods." He paused, staring into the fire. "But years teach you things that youth cannot understand. I learned that true strength, the kind that matters when you face your final judgment, comes from choosing to help, even when it costs you something dear." Eric listened in silence, sensing that he was hearing something the old warrior rarely shared. "Besides," Bjorn continued with a slight smile, "you said you served Lord Hakon of Stavanger. Perhaps he would reward the man who brought his injured servant home safely." At the mention of Lord Hakon, Eric's expression grew complex, part sadness, part something that might have been guilt. "Lord Hakon is a good man, but I fear my service to him has ended. I was traveling on his business when the bandits attacked. I failed in my duty." "Did you flee the fight?" Bjorn asked bluntly. "No." "Did you betray your lord's trust?" "Never." "Then you did not fail. Sometimes the Norns weave patterns we cannot see or understand. What matters is that you faced your fate with honor." As they prepared to leave the cave, Bjorn carefully examined Eric's wounds in the morning light. The leg infection showed signs of improvement. The angry red lines were fading, and the wound itself looked cleaner. The broken arm would need proper splinting, but it would heal. It was the head wound that concerned him most now. While not deep, it had left Eric with occasional dizziness and moments of confusion. "You'll ride on my back again today," Bjorn announced, ignoring Eric's protests. "The path down from these heights is treacherous even for the sure-footed. With your injuries, attempting to walk would be suicide." As they made their way down the winding mountain path, the landscape gradually changed around them. The harsh peaks and pine forests gave way to gentler hills dotted with birch and oak. The air grew warmer, and by midday they could see smoke rising from distant farmsteads. Eric, despite his injuries, proved to be good company, intelligent and well-spoken, with stories of his own that helped pass the miles. It was as they crested a hill overlooking a prosperous-looking settlement that Eric suddenly tensed on Bjorn's back. "Put me down," he said urgently. "Please put me down here." Bjorn complied, helping Eric to sit against a large stone beside the path. The young man's face had gone pale, and he stared down at the settlement with an expression of deep conflict. "What troubles you?" Bjorn asked, following Eric's gaze. The town below looked peaceful enough, well-built houses with smoke rising from their chimneys, people moving about their daily business, fields showing the golden stubble of a successful harvest. "That's Stavanger," Eric said quietly. "My home." Bjorn frowned. The urgency in Eric's voice suggested something more than simple homesickness. "You should be glad to see it. Your lord will be relieved to know you survived the bandit attack." Eric was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the largest building in the settlement, a fine hall with carved wooden posts and a roof of carefully laid timber shingles. "Bjorn," he said finally, "I haven't been entirely honest with you." The old warrior's hand moved instinctively toward his sayax, though he made no threatening gesture. "Speak plainly. My name is Eric, that much is true, but I'm not merely a servant." He took a shuddering breath. "Lord Hakon of Stavanger was my father. I am his son and heir." Bjorn's eyes widened slightly, but otherwise his expression remained neutral. "Go on." "My father and we had words before I left. Harsh words. I was angry with him for arranging a marriage I didn't want, for treating me like a child instead of a man grown. I told him I would prove my worth by handling the trade negotiations in Bergen myself, without his advisors or guards." Eric's voice grew thick with regret. My pride, My foolish pride led me to travel with only a small escort. When the bandits came, your men, Bjorn asked quietly. Dead, all of them. Good men who died because their prince was too proud to listen to wisdom. Tears ran down Eric's face now, unchecked. And now, how can I face my father? How can I tell him that his son's arrogance cost the lives of loyal men? Bjorn was quiet for a long time, studying the young man's anguished face. Finally, he spoke. You think your father would prefer you dead as well? I think my father would prefer a son who showed better judgment, perhaps. Bjorn settled himself more comfortably against a tree, clearly intending to stay until this conversation reached its natural end. But I suspect he would prefer a living son who has learned from his mistakes to a dead one who never had the chance to grow wiser. He gestured toward the settlement below. See how the smoke rises straight up from those chimneys? That means the wind is still, the air peaceful. But look at the fields. I count at least a dozen men working there who should be preparing for winter in their own homes. Those are search parties, boy. Your father has every able-bodied man in the region looking for you. Eric followed Bjorn's pointing finger and saw the truth of it. What he had taken for normal farming activity was indeed organized search parties, spreading out across the countryside in a systematic pattern. He thinks I'm dead, Eric whispered. He hopes you're alive, Bjorn corrected. There's a difference. Dead men don't need search parties. As if summoned by their conversation, a horn sounded from the settlement below, 3 long blasts that echoed across the hills. Almost immediately, the scattered search parties began converging on the town center. Someone's brought news, Bjorn observed. Good or ill, we'll know soon enough. But Eric was no longer listening. His attention was fixed on a figure that had emerged from the great hall and now stood in the settlement's central square. Even at this distance, even after months of separation, he recognized the proud bearing and silver-streaked hair of Lord Hakon. My father, he breathed. Bjorn studied the scene below with the tactical eye of an old warrior. He's aged since you left. See how his shoulders sit? That's the posture of a man carrying great grief. Indeed, even from their distant vantage point, Lord Hakon's bearing spoke of a man bowed down by worry and loss. As the search parties returned to report their findings, or lack thereof, his shoulders seemed to sink further. I have to go to him, Eric said suddenly, struggling to rise despite his injuries. Whatever shame I must bear, he needs to know I'm alive. Bjorn caught his arm gently, but firmly. Aye, you do, but not looking like a beggar who's crawled out of the wilderness. You're a prince returning home. Act like one. The old warrior helped Eric to his feet, then began the process of making him as presentable as possible. He combed the worst tangles from Eric's hair with his own bone comb, used water from his skin to wash the grime from the young man's face, and arranged his torn cloak to better conceal his injuries. There, he said when he was satisfied. You look like a prince who survived a hard journey, not a corpse that's climbed out of its grave. As they made their way down the hill towards Stavanger, Eric leaning heavily on a walking stick Bjorn had cut for him, a crowd began to gather in the settlement's main square. Word travelled quickly in small communities, and by the time they reached the wooden bridge that crossed the stream at the settlement's edge, it seemed like half the population had turned out to see what new news the strangers brought. But it was Lord Hakon who reached them first. The older man had spotted them while they were still some distance away and had come running, actually running, despite his dignity and advancing years, to meet them. Eric, he called out when he was still 50 paces away, his voice cracking with hope and disbelief. Eric, my son, father, Eric replied. And then he was in Lord Hakon's arms, both men weeping openly as the crowd pressed closer. Bjorn stepped back respectfully, giving father and son their moment of reunion. But Lord Hakon, even in his joy, was too seasoned a leader to forget his manners. You, he said, turning to Bjorn with tears still streaming down his face. You brought my son home. What is your name, warrior? Bjorn Ironbeard, my lord, of no fixed dwelling, but born in the North Fjords. Lord Hakon clasped Bjorn's shoulders with hands that trembled with emotion. Bjorn Ironbeard, you have given me back my son, my heir, my heart. Ask anything of me. gold, land, position in my household, and it shall be yours." But Bjorn was already shaking his head. "I ask for nothing, my lord. Any man would have done the same." "But any man did not," Lord Hakon replied firmly. "You did, and you shall be rewarded." He paused, studying the old warrior's weathered face. "But first, you both look like you need food, rest, and healing. Come, let us see to your needs, and then we shall speak of rewards." As they made their way through the cheering crowd toward Lord Hakon's hall, Eric caught Bjorn's arm. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything, for carrying me, for saving my life, for helping me find the courage to come home." Bjorn's only reply was a gruff nod, but his pale eyes held a warmth that spoke louder than words. That evening, after Eric's wounds had been properly tended by the settlement's healer, and both men had been fed and given clean clothes, Lord Hakon called for a feast to celebrate his son's return. The great hall filled with the sounds of celebration, laughter, singing, the clink of ale horns, and the stories of men sharing their joy. But it was when the formal festivities were winding down that Lord Hakon rose from his place at the high table and called for silence. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet hall, "tonight we celebrate more than my son's safe return. We celebrate the honor and courage of the man who brought him home." He gestured to Bjorn, who sat at the place of honor to his right. "Bjorn Ironbeard found my son broken and dying in the mountains. He could have passed by. He was traveling on urgent business of his own. Instead, he chose to help a stranger, even at great cost to himself." The hall murmured with approval, but Lord Hakon raised his hand for continued silence. "This morning, I offered this good man any reward he might name. He asked for nothing, but I am Lord of Stavanger, and I will not let such nobility go unrewarded." He turned to face Bjorn directly. "Bjorn Ironbeard, I offer you half of all I possess. Half my lands, half my wealth, half my authority. You shall be joint lord of this domain, with all the rights and honors that position entails." The hall erupted in surprised murmurs. Such generosity was unprecedented, and the political implications were staggering. But Lord Hakon continued over the noise. "Furthermore, you shall be as a brother to me and a second father to my son. Your word shall carry the same weight as mine, your judgment shall be law, and your honor shall be the honor of our house." Bjorn sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the magnitude of the offer slowly sinking in. Around him, the hall waited with bated breath for his response. Finally, the old warrior rose slowly to his feet. "My lord," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I am deeply honored by your offer, but I must tell you, I am not worthy of such trust. I'm a man with blood on his hands, a raider who has taken from the innocent and caused great suffering in his youth." "As have we all," Lord Hakon replied firmly. "What matters is not what we were, but what we choose to become. You chose to help my son when you had every reason to pass by. That choice reveals your true character." Bjorn looked around the hall, seeing faces filled with acceptance and welcome. These people were prepared to follow him based on nothing more than their Lord's word and the story of his rescue of Eric. It was a trust he had never expected to receive, and certainly never thought he deserved. But as his eyes met Eric's across the hall, he saw in the young prince's face something that decided him. Eric needed guidance, needed someone who could help him grow from the proud, impulsive youth who had nearly died in the mountains into the wise leader his people deserved. And Bjorn, for all his faults, had learned hard lessons about leadership and honor. "If you truly believe I can serve your people well," he said finally, "then I accept your offer with gratitude and humility." The hall exploded in cheers, and ale horns were raised in toast after toast to the new joint lord of Stavanger. But through all the celebration, Bjorn found his thoughts returning to his grandson, still waiting for medicine that might never come. As if reading his mind, Lord Hakon leaned close and spoke quietly in his ear. "Your grandson, Eric, told me of your urgent journey. I've already sent my fastest riders with the medicine and my best healer. They should reach him within 2 days." Bjorn's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. My lord, my brother, Lord Håkon corrected with a smile. We are family now, and family takes care of its own. As the night wore on and the celebration continued around them, Bjorn Ironbeard reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had set out from his lonely home, expecting nothing more than a race against time to save his grandson's life. Instead, he had found a new family, a new purpose, and a chance to use his hard-earned wisdom in service of something greater than himself. The Norns, it seemed, wove patterns more complex and beautiful than any mortal mind could comprehend. 5 years had passed since that fateful night, when Bjorn Ironbeard accepted Lord Håkon's unprecedented offer, and the settlement of Stavanger had flourished under their joint rule. What had once been a prosperous but unremarkable holding had grown into one of the most respected domains in all of Norway. The harmony between the two leaders, one young and passionate, the other wise and measured, had created a golden age of peace and prosperity. On this crisp autumn morning, Bjorn stood on the wooden ramparts of Stavanger's expanded fortifications, watching the sun rise over lands that now felt truly like home. His grandson Magnus, now a healthy boy of 12 winters, practiced sword work in the courtyard below under Eric's patient instruction. The medicine had arrived in time 5 years ago, and the boy had recovered completely, growing strong and tall under the care of Stavanger's healers. "Grandfather Bjorn!" Magnus called up to him, using the title that had evolved naturally despite their lack of blood relation. "Prince Eric says I'm ready to try the advanced forms." Bjorn chuckled and waved acknowledgement. Eric, still called Prince by most, though he would inherit joint lordship when his father passed, had proven to be an excellent teacher. The proud, impulsive youth who had nearly died in the mountains had matured into a thoughtful leader, his judgment tempered by experience and guided by Bjorn's steady counsel. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Bjorn's attention to the main road, where a small party of riders approached under a banner he didn't immediately recognize. Visitors were common now. Stavanger's reputation for fair dealing and wise governance had spread throughout the region, bringing traders, supplicants, and dignitaries seeking audience with the unusual dual lordship. Lord Håkon emerged from the great hall below, his hair now fully silver, but his bearing still proud and strong. At 68 winters, he remained an active ruler, though he increasingly relied on both Bjorn and Eric to handle the day-to-day governance of their expanded domain. "More visitors," Håkon called up to Bjorn. "The messenger who arrived yesterday spoke truly. Word of our success has reached even the court of King Harald." Indeed, the approaching party proved to be a royal delegation, sent by the king himself to investigate reports of the remarkable partnership that had transformed a minor lordship into a beacon of prosperity and justice. The lead rider, a man of obvious importance judging by his rich clothes and proud bearing, dismounted and approached with the formal precision of a court official. "I seek Lord Håkon of Stavanger and his partner, Bjorn Ironbeard," the man announced. "You have found them both," Håkon replied with dignified courtesy. Bjorn had descended from the ramparts and now stood beside his friend and co-ruler. "I am Håkon, and this is Bjorn. You are welcome in our hall." The official's eyes widened slightly as he took in Bjorn's appearance. The old warrior had aged well in his new position. His beard was now fully white, but still thick and strong, his blue eyes clear and sharp, his bearing that of a man who had found his proper place in the world. "I am Torald Eriksson, speaker for King Harald Fairhair," the official said with a formal bow. "His Majesty has heard remarkable tales of your joint rule and wishes to understand how such an arrangement has proven so successful." Over the next 3 days, the royal delegation observed every aspect of Stavanger's governance. They watched Bjorn and Håkon preside jointly over the settlement of disputes, their different perspectives and approaches complementing each other perfectly. They saw how Eric had grown into his role as heir and future leader, his natural charisma balanced by the wisdom both older men had imparted. They witnessed the prosperity that had flowed from their careful stewardship, new settlements, expanded trade routes, and a level of peace and security that was rare in those turbulent times. But it was on the final evening, during a feast held in the delegation's honor, that Thorold asked the question that had really brought him to Stavanger. "Lord Bjorn," he said, raising his ale-horn in salute, "men speak in wonder of your story. They say you found Prince Eric dying in the mountains and carried him to safety, asking nothing in return. They say Lord Håkon offered you half his kingdom, and you nearly refused such unprecedented generosity. What I wish to understand is this: what drives a man to such selfless action?" The great hall fell quiet, all attention focused on Bjorn. The old warrior was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes distant, as if looking back across the years to that night in the mountain cave. "When I was young," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "I believed that strength meant taking what you wanted. I sailed with raiding parties, took treasure from those who couldn't defend it, and told myself it was the way of our people." He paused, his gaze moving around the hall, taking in the faces of the people who had become his family and his responsibility. "But I learned, through years and loss and the wisdom that comes with age, that true strength lies not in taking but in giving, not in conquering but in building, not in standing alone but in lifting others up." His eyes found Eric's across the hall, then Lord Hakon's, then settled on young Magnus, who listened with the intense attention only children can bring to adult conversations. "I carried Eric not because I expected reward, but because it was the right thing to do, because leaving him to die would have diminished me, regardless of whether anyone ever knew. And when Lord Håkon offered me half his kingdom," he smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "He offered me something I had never known I was searching for, not wealth or power, but purpose, a chance to build something lasting, something good." Thorold nodded slowly, clearly moved by the simple honesty of the answer. "And you, Lord Håkon? You offered half your power to a man you had just met. Many would call such generosity either saintly or foolish." Lord Håkon laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Perhaps both. But I saw in Bjorn's actions the kind of man I wanted standing beside me, the kind of example I wanted my son to follow. Generosity given freely often returns tenfold." "Indeed it has," Thorold replied. "Your domain has grown more in 5 years than most do in 50. Your people are prosperous and content, your borders secure, your reputation for justice known throughout the land. King Harold himself spoke of Stavanger as an example of what strong leadership can accomplish." As the evening wore on and the celebration continued, Bjorn found himself standing once again on the ramparts, looking out over the land that had become his home. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns as old as time itself, and he thought of the Norns weaving the threads of fate that had brought him to this moment. Eric joined him there, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. "Do you ever regret it?" the prince asked quietly. "The life you left behind? The freedom of the wandering warrior?" Bjorn considered the question seriously. "I regret much of what I did in my younger years. The pain I caused, the lives I took in pursuit of glory that proved empty. But regret the path that led me here? Never." He gestured toward the hall below, where music and laughter spilled out into the night air. "I spent 68 years learning how to live, Eric. These past 5 have been the first where I truly understood what living meant." "And what is that?" Bjorn's smile was visible even in the starlight. "Knowing that when the Norns cut your thread at last, you leave the world a little better than you found it. Knowing that the choices you made, especially the hard ones, the costly ones, served something greater than yourself." As if to emphasize his words, the sound of children's laughter drifted up from the settlement below. Somewhere in those warm-lit houses were families who slept safely because of the peace Bjorn and Håkon had built together. Somewhere were merchants who traded fairly because they knew justice awaited any who would cheat or steal. Somewhere were young people who had seen in their leader's example that strength and kindness were not opposites but partners. The old stories speak of warriors earning immortality through glorious death in battle, Eric said thoughtfully. But perhaps true immortality comes from living in a way that echoes through the generations. Aye, Bjorn agreed. And perhaps the greatest treasure a man can find is not gold or silver, but the knowledge that his choices mattered. Years later, when bards sang of the unlikely partnership that had transformed Stavanger from a minor holding into a shining example of wise rule, they would speak of the night an old Viking carried an injured stranger through the mountains. They would tell of unexpected generosity freely given and graciously received. They would celebrate the way two men, different in age and experience but united in purpose, had shown that honor and wisdom could triumph over pride and greed. But those who knew the true story understood that its deepest meaning lay not in the grand gestures or the remarkable rewards, but in the simple choice made on a dark mountain path. The choice to help rather than pass by. The choice to give rather than take. The choice to build rather than destroy. In the end, it was not the half-kingdom that mattered, but the whole heart that earned it. And in the intricate tapestry of fate that the Norns weave for every soul, few threads shine brighter than those spun from simple human kindness, offered freely when it costs the most to give. The story of Bjorn Ironbeard and Prince Eric became legend, passed down through generations, as proof that in a world often cruel and harsh, nobility of spirit could still triumph. That sometimes carrying a stranger's burden leads not to loss, but to the greatest reward of all, a life lived with meaning, purpose and honor. And in the great hall of Stavanger, where their portraits hang side by side, visitors still pause to wonder at the faces of two men who proved that true kingship lies not in taking what you want, but in giving what others need.